Tonight, we're stepping straight into the real Wild West. And no, not the polished Hollywood version with noble cowboys and perfectly staged gunfights, but the raw, unforgiving reality where every single day was a gamble for survival. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but believe me, there's a reason people called it wild. If you're enjoying these journeys into history, a quick like or a subscribe would mean a lot. It honestly helps more than you might think. I also love hearing where everyone's tuning in from, so drop a comment with your city and the time of day there. It's amazing seeing this little global community come together through these stories. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe let a fan run in the background for that low, steady hum, and let's ease into tonight's adventure. Because what we're about to uncover is why you probably wouldn't even last a single day in the lawless, untamed American frontier. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the Wild West of the 1870s. Here's the good news. You're about to step right into one of the most legendary eras in history. The bad news? Your odds of surviving just plummeted. The first challenge hits before you've even opened your eyes, the smell. And it's not that crisp, earthy freshness you'd expect from the great outdoors. No, this is harsher. The stench of unwashed bodies, piles of animal waste, and quite possibly, raw sewage lingers heavy in the air. Out here, bathing wasn't exactly at the top of anyone's to-do list. For most settlers, a full wash was considered a monthly luxury, and even that was pushing it. Some folks would go the entire winter without ever touching a proper bath. Out here, water was worth more than gold. And when every drop had to be hauled, stored, and rationed, using it just to wash yourself seemed wasteful compared to the real priorities: drinking, cooking, and keeping your animals alive. You drag yourself up from your so-called bed, which is little more than a straw-stuffed mattress alive with bedbugs, and immediately feel it. Every muscle in your body throbs with soreness. That's just daily life on the frontier. In the 1870s, survival demanded endless physical labor from the moment the sun came up until long after it disappeared. There were no weekends, no breaks, no vacations. And forget about comfort. Ergonomic wasn't even a word in their vocabulary. Farmer, miner, ranch hand, it didn't matter what you did. Your body was the one tool you had, and you used it until it wore out. Think your modern 9-to-5 is exhausting? Frontier labor was in a league of its own. Grueling, backbreaking work that left even the toughest men and women bent, crippled, and riddled with arthritis by the time they hit their 30s. Picture yourself pushing a plow for 14 hours, carrying buckets of water, chopping endless cords of wood, or clawing away at rock deep inside a suffocating mineshaft. It's no surprise the average lifespan barely touched 35 years. You step onto the cabin's dusty floorboards and instantly notice the bite of the air. If it's winter, you could wake to temperatures 20 degrees below freezing inside your home. Maybe you had a fireplace, but chances are you let it die down overnight. Wood was precious, and wasting fuel could mean disaster later. And if it's summer, prepare to soak through every piece of clothing you own, because there was no escaping the elements. Central heating, insulation, or even something as simple as thermal underwear, none of that existed here. In the Wild West, the weather ruled you, not the other way around. And speaking of clothes, forget comfort. Most men own maybe 2 sets total. Rough canvas or heavy denim trousers paired with stiff cotton shirts that rubbed raw against the skin. Women had it even worse, layering themselves in chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged through the dust and mud no matter the weather. Everything itched, everything pinched, and almost nothing was ever properly washed. Those elegant, perfectly tailored outfits you see in Western movies? Pure fantasy for the average settler. Your stomach growls, pulling your attention to breakfast. Hope you've got a taste for repetition, because out here it's beans, biscuits, and coffee, morning, noon, and night. The diet of the Wild West was as bland as it was unbalanced. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare seasonal treasures, and when you did get meat, It was usually preserved with salt or smoke, since refrigeration hadn't been invented yet. Malnutrition was common, and scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, ravaged many settlers. Imagine your gums bleeding and your teeth loosening, all because no one understood how simple it was to prevent. And then there's the coffee. Movies love to show cowboys brewing the perfect pot over a fire, but what you'd actually get barely deserves the name. It was boiled to oblivion, leaving it so bitter it could strip paint. Settlers often tossed in crushed eggshells or even a pinch of salt just to cut the edge. Still, in a world this demanding, caffeine was a lifeline. So, you'd choke it down without complaint, grateful for whatever fuel it gave you to survive another day. Before you even think about stepping outside, you'd be wise to check your boots. Out here, scorpions or snakes often crawled in during the night, seeking warmth or shelter. For people on the frontier, shaking out footwear each morning wasn't superstition, it was survival, a routine carved from painful lessons. One careless mistake could leave you with a venomous bite and miles of wilderness between you and any hope of medical care. When you finally push open the cabin door, the first thing you notice is just how exposed you are. The American frontier stretched endlessly, a landscape as stunning as it was merciless. Nature ruled here, and it could turn on you without a whisper of warning. A blizzard, a tornado, a sudden flash flood, or even months of brutal drought, any of these could spell disaster for those unprepared. The sky might look calm now, but out here, it could change in the blink of an eye. And if you'd chosen life in a frontier town, you might imagine that civilization offered a safety net. In truth, it simply brought a different set of dangers. These towns were breeding grounds for disease. Without sewage systems, sanitation, or even the basic understanding of how germs spread, sickness tore through communities unchecked. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were ever-present killers. One outbreak could rip through the streets and claim half a town in just a matter of weeks. Let's imagine you decide to head into town today. As you get closer, one of the first things that stands out is the lack of structure. Forget neat rows of streets or careful city planning. Most Western towns sprouted up wherever people happened to stake a claim, with buildings thrown together wherever space allowed. Infrastructure was an afterthought, if it existed at all. The streets aren't paved, instead, they're little more than dirt paths. When the rain falls, those tracks turn into thick, sticky mud pits, and when the weather dries out, they become swirling clouds of choking dust. Then the smell hits, sharp and overwhelming. Horses were the backbone of transportation here, and with them came manure, piles of it, scattered across every street. There were no sanitation workers, no cleanup crews, nobody tasked with keeping the roads clear. In some busy towns, the buildup of waste could literally rise to your knees in the most heavily traveled areas. As flies buzz thick around your head, the reality sets in. This is exactly why sickness and disease found such easy footing in these frontier communities. Strolling down the main street, you pass by the saloon, almost always one of the busiest spots in any frontier town. But don't picture the polished Hollywood version with its swinging doors, cheerful piano tunes, and polished brass rails. The reality was far rougher. Most saloons were nothing more than a single, bare-bones room, outfitted with crude plank bars and whatever mismatched furniture people could cobble together. And the liquor? It wasn't the smooth, oak-aged whiskey you see poured in Western films. More often, it was raw, unrefined alcohol, sometimes cut with things like tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it an extra punch. One unlucky sip could leave you sick, or even blind. But beyond the foul drinks, saloons represented another constant danger of frontier life: violence. These weren't stages for dramatic duels at high noon. In truth, the majority of bloodshed came from drunken arguments that spiraled out of control in a world where nearly everyone carried a weapon. The romanticized gunfights of Western legends were few and far between. Real violence here was sudden, sloppy, and usually sparked by something as trivial as an insult or a spilled drink. One thing you'll notice quickly is that nearly everyone is armed, but not always for the reasons you might assume. Sure, self-defense played a role, but more often, firearms and knives were everyday tools. They were used for hunting game, fending off dangerous animals, or even signaling across distances. In a land where bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes were constant threats, traveling without a weapon wasn't brave, it was reckless. What might surprise you, though, is that many frontier towns enforced strict gun control. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, actually required visitors to hand over their firearms upon entering town limits. In fact, the infamous gunfight at the O.K. Corral was sparked because the Clanton gang refused to obey Tombstone's weapons ordinance. And those iconic showdowns you've seen on the big screen, the quick-draw duels at high noon, they're mostly myth. In reality, such spectacles were incredibly rare. Frontier shootings were far less glamorous, usually ambushes, botched robberies, or drunken brawls that spiraled out of control. Real violence on the frontier was fast, unpredictable, and almost always devoid of honor or fairness. As you continue down the street, you come across the local doctor's office. Step inside, though, and you'd be horrified by what passed for medical care in the 1870s frontier. Many so-called doctors had little to no formal training, and their methods reflected it. Surgeries were often performed with nothing more than whiskey or a dose of morphine to dull the pain, while the concept of sterilization was almost non-existent. A simple infected cut could spiral into blood poisoning, amputation, or death. Treatments weren't much better. Bloodletting was common, along with the use of mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances that frequently did more harm than good. For women, childbirth was particularly dangerous. In isolated areas, as many as 1 in 4 mothers didn't survive the experience. Dentistry was its own nightmare. With no anesthesia, extractions were carried out using crude tools, and most people lived for years with agonizing dental problems before eventually losing their teeth entirely. If you were unlucky enough to get injured or fall out here, your chances of survival often depended more on pure luck than on medical skill. Even minor wounds could turn deadly if infection set in, and broken bones frequently healed wrong, leaving people with permanent pain or disability. Out here, the old saying, "Only the strong survive," wasn't just a figure of speech, it was a daily reality. Your stomach rumbles again, reminding you it's time for lunch. You make your way to the local restaurant, which is usually nothing more than an extension of someone's home, where they serve meals for a fee. Don't expect variety. The menu looks almost identical to breakfast. The meat is often tough, sometimes even spoiled despite being salted or smoked, and vegetables, if they're on the plate at all, are boiled down into flavorless mush. Food safety regulations simply didn't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning were a regular part of life. As you pick through your meal, you catch fragments of conversation drifting from nearby tables, talk of recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or warnings about the dangers of traveling alone. The reality, though, was more complicated than the stories make it seem. Violence from Native Americans toward settlers did occur, but it was far less common than popular culture has led us to believe. In fact, it was usually settlers or the U.S. military acting as aggressors. Still, the forced displacement of indigenous peoples created constant friction, and at times that tension erupted into bloody conflict on both sides. And then there were the outlaws. They weren't just tall tales whispered around the campfire. They were a real threat, especially in isolated areas where law enforcement was little more than a distant rumor. Law enforcement on the frontier was stretched impossibly thin. A single sheriff might be responsible for thousands of square miles, making it nearly impossible to maintain order. In many communities, justice wasn't served in a courtroom. It was delivered by vigilantes. Lynch mobs were a common sight, and the principle of innocent until proven guilty, often didn't exist. Accusations of horse theft or cattle rustling could mean you were swinging from a tree before the day was out, whether you were guilty or not. After lunch, you wander over to the local general store to stock up on supplies, and immediately feel the sting of sticker shock. Everyday necessities cost far more here than they did back east, thanks to the brutal expense of transporting goods across such vast distances. Something as simple as a can of peaches could set you back what would amount to $20 in today's money. For many settlers, nearly every cent of their income went toward survival: food, tools, fuel, leaving little to nothing for comfort or luxury. But beyond the prices, the store also reveals another harsh truth of frontier life: isolation. Mail delivery was rare and unreliable, and when newspapers finally arrived, their stories were often weeks or even months old. Information moved painfully slowly, and letters from family back home could take years, or never come at all. For many who moved west, leaving meant saying goodbye to loved ones forever. That isolation carried a heavy cost. Loneliness, disconnection, and endless hardship fed high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide. On the frontier, survival wasn't just a physical battle, it was a psychological one too. As the afternoon stretches on, you spot dark clouds building on the horizon. Out here, weather wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. With no modern forecasting, storms arrived suddenly and without warning. A blizzard could trap travelers until they froze to death. A tornado could level an entire settlement in minutes, leaving survivors with no emergency services to turn to. Flash floods could sweep away entire wagon trains, and prolonged droughts destroyed crops, leaving families on the edge of starvation. Even if you were fortunate enough to have a house, it offered only the barest protection. Most dwellings were thrown together from whatever materials could be found: sod houses across the plains, rough-hewn log cabins in forest country, or simple wooden shacks in the towns. None of them stood much chance against the fury of nature. Inside, winter temperatures often plunged below freezing, while summer heat baked the rooms, especially in cramped attics or upper floors where people slept. Watching the storm creep closer, you make the only sensible choice: head back to your cabin and brace for what's coming. On your way back, you pass a group of men trudging toward the local mine. Mining was among the most dangerous jobs on the entire frontier. Underground cave-ins could bury workers alive, while toxic gases silently suffocated those unlucky enough to breathe them in. Explosions from poorly handled blasting powder were a constant risk, and primitive machinery caused gruesome accidents on a daily basis. Even those who survived the day-to-day hazards often faced slow, painful deaths from long-term illnesses, black lung from coal dust, or mercury poisoning from processing gold. And mining wasn't the only line of work that carried brutal risks. Farming meant wrestling with heavy, unprotected equipment that could maim or kill in an instant. Ranching demanded constant contact with massive, unpredictable animals capable of crushing a person without warning. Logging, too, claimed lives at alarming rates, one of the deadliest professions of them all. No matter what path you chose to earn a living out here, danger was woven into the job. Compared to the relative safety of modern work, the odds of serious injury or death on the frontier were staggeringly higher. You reach your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. Almost immediately, water seeps through the roof in several places, forcing you to set out buckets to catch the drips. Still, it's not all bad news. This becomes a chance to collect drinking water, a resource that was always scarce and invaluable. On the frontier, many settlers were forced to draw water from the same streams or ponds used for bathing livestock and washing clothes. Unsurprisingly, this led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases that could turn deadly in a matter of days. Sitting inside your drafty, leaky cabin, listening to the steady patter of rain, you can't help but reflect on how far the reality strays from the romanticized image of the Wild West. There weren't shining heroes or dastardly villains, just ordinary people trying to endure in conditions that push them to their limits. The fact that anyone managed to survive at all stands as a powerful testament to human resilience and determination. Night falls quickly when there's no electricity. Your world is reduced to the flicker of candles and the dim glow of an oil lamp, both of which you handle with care. Out here, fire was always a lurking threat. A single stray spark could reduce an entire home to ashes, and with no fire department to call, many towns saw their main streets burn to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed, worn down by the relentless demands of just a single day in the Wild West. Every muscle throbs with fatigue, your stomach churns from the rough food, and your mind feels drained from the constant awareness needed simply to survive. As you close your eyes, you can't help but wonder, will you make it through tomorrow, or will you become just another forgotten casualty of frontier life? The wind howls outside, rattling the cabin and serving as a chilling reminder of how small and fragile people are when measured against the vast, untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're fortunate enough to see it, will bring the same trials all over again, along with new ones you can't yet imagine. Out here, survival wasn't promised. It had to be earned, day by day, hour by hour, through hardships few modern people could even begin to grasp. As dawn creeps in, thin beams of light slip through the cracks in your cabin walls, dragging you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the lumpy mattress beneath you, but there's no time to dwell on it. The Wild West waits for no one. As you get up, memories of yesterday's harsh lessons linger, and you can't help but wonder what new challenges today has in store. Let's imagine you decide to leave town and venture out across the frontier. Maybe you're heading toward another settlement, joining a wagon train on its push westward, or simply striking out to explore. Whatever your purpose, travel in the 1870s was nothing like the convenience you're accustomed to today. The good news? By this point, the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, linking America's east and west coasts for the very first time. The bad news? Unless you were well off or traveling along one of its major routes, the train was out of reach. For most frontier families, transportation still meant long days on horseback, bumpy rides in a wagon, or mile after mile trudging on foot. If you were lucky enough to own a horse, you stood a step ahead of many settlers. Horses were expensive, often costing several months' wages, and the expense didn't stop there. Saddles, bridles, feed, and basic care all added up quickly. And veterinary care, on the frontier often meant something grim. If a horse broke a leg or fell ill beyond use, the only option was to put it down. Even when healthy, riding was no pleasure. Saddles of the 1870s weren't built for comfort, but for function. After hours on the trail, even seasoned riders ended up with blisters, sore muscles, and aching backs. And horses spooked easily, at snakes, sudden noises, or a shifting shadow, sending riders tumbling. A fall could leave you with broken bones or worse, far from any doctor or help. If you couldn't afford a horse, your next option was the wagon. But forget the romantic image of pioneers rolling happily across golden prairies. In truth, wagon travel was grueling. With no suspension beyond the slight flecks of wooden wheels, every rut, rock, and bump rattled through the frame. The constant jolting left passengers nauseous, a misery often compared to seasickness. And then there were the roads, or rather, the lack of them. Most trails were nothing more than dirt tracks left behind by earlier travelers. After heavy rain, they turned into muddy traps where wagons sank axle deep. In dry spells, the dust grew so thick it choked the air and blinded your vision. Breakdowns were common too. Splintered wheels or snapped axles often stranded families miles from the nearest settlement, with little hope of rescue. Now imagine you've set your sights on California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train pushing west along the legendary Oregon Trail, a trek that stretched nearly 2,000 miles and stood among the most dangerous journeys of the 19th century. Between the 1840s and 1860s, roughly 400,000 people attempted it. But the odds were grim. about 1 in 10 never made it to their destination. The Oregon Trail became known as the nation's longest graveyard. Historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every single mile of the trail. Think about that, roughly a grave every 350 feet, stretching for 2,000 miles. The path west was marked with crude wooden crosses and rough stone cairns, many bearing no names at all. Families who lost loved ones had no choice but to stop, bury them by the roadside, and press on, leaving behind a trail of sorrow that scarred the land as much as wagon ruts did. On the Oregon Trail, the deadliest enemy wasn't raids or accidents, it was disease. The number one killer was cholera, a bacterial infection spread through tainted water supplies. This brutal illness brought on relentless diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that someone could wake up healthy in the morning and be buried by nightfall. With no effective treatment, outbreaks tore through wagon trains, sometimes claiming dozens of lives in a matter of days. Cholera wasn't the only threat. Dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever cut down travelers by the thousands. Children were especially vulnerable, and it was tragically common for families to lose more than one child along the journey. Medical care offered little hope. Most treatments were crude folk remedies, concoctions that at best did nothing and at worst accelerated the suffering. On the trail, survival often came down to sheer luck rather than skill or medicine. Crossing rivers was another deadly obstacle on the road west. Wagons weren't designed to float, yet pioneers faced countless rivers along the trail. Sometimes there were ferries or shallow fords, but more often families were forced to attempt risky crossings, trying to float their heavy wagons like makeshift boats. Many didn't make it. Wagons capsized, livestock drowned, and precious supplies were swept away. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers alone claimed hundreds of lives during the migration era. And despite what popular culture suggests, Native American attacks were relatively rare. In truth, many tribes offered help, trading supplies, guiding travelers, or even lending assistance during river crossings. The Rayal killers were far less sensational. Most violent deaths on the trail came from accidents, being crushed under wagon wheels, drowning in swollen rivers, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were alarmingly frequent too, since most travelers carried weapons for hunting or protection but had little actual experience using them. Beyond the physical dangers, the emotional toll was staggering. Families often had to bury children, parents, or spouses along the trail, sometimes hastily marking the grave with a wooden cross or a pile of stones, before climbing back into their wagons and moving on, grief carried with them every step of the way. On the trail, there was little room for extended mourning. Every day spent grieving meant losing precious time, and each delay lowered the odds of making it through the mountain passes before winter snows sealed them off. The relentless grind of stress, grief, and exhaustion pushed many to their breaking point, and suicides were not uncommon among weary migrants. And even if you did manage to survive the long road to California or Oregon, your struggles weren't over. Many families arrived having exhausted every coin and scrap of food just to get there. Malnourished, sick, and penniless, they often discovered that the so-called Promised Land came with its own harsh set of realities. But perhaps you chose a different path. Maybe you weren't crossing half a continent, just setting out for a nearby town or settlement. Even these shorter journeys carried real dangers. Lone travelers and small groups were tempting targets for outlaws looking for easy prey. And while dime novels and Hollywood films would later exaggerate the frequency of stagecoach robberies, they did happen often enough to keep every traveler on edge. The natural environment itself was a relentless adversary for anyone traveling the frontier. Flash floods could sweep away trails in moments, stranding wagons and drowning the unprepared. In the desert, summer heat bore down with lethal force, claiming lives through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter brought its own horrors, blizzards that trapped travelers in snowdrifts, sometimes leading to slow, freezing deaths. In the most desperate cases, like the infamous Donner Party, survival descended into cannibalism. Even finding your way was no simple matter. With no detailed maps and no GPS to rely on, travelers had little more than vague directions, shifting landmarks, and the word of guides, some skilled, others dangerously inexperienced. A single mistake in navigation could leave a group wandering aimlessly in the wilderness, burning through precious supplies. Out here, losing your way wasn't just inconvenient, it could be a death sentence. As you continue your journey, you notice something that Hollywood rarely gets right: the incredible diversity of the frontier. The Wild West wasn't just the land of white cowboys and settlers, it was a crossroads of cultures from all over the world. Chinese immigrants played vital roles as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had lived throughout the Southwest for generations, long before the region became U.S. territory. Black cowboys, often overlooked in popular portrayals, made up as much as a quarter of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants, Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians, brought their traditions, languages, and skills into the mix. And of course, dozens of Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before anyone else arrived. But diversity didn't mean equality, nor did it guarantee peace. Racial violence was woven into daily frontier life. Chinese workers faced vicious discrimination, often being forced into the most grueling and dangerous jobs while earning far less than their white counterparts. After the Mexican-American War, many Mexican landowners saw their property stripped away, sometimes through shady legal tricks, other times by outright theft. Black Americans, who moved west seeking freedom from Southern oppression, discovered that prejudice was alive and well on the frontier, just wearing a different face. Despite their critical contributions to ranching, mining, and the building of new communities, they were routinely shut out of economic opportunities and denied social acceptance. For Native Americans, the westward expansion of white settlement was nothing less than catastrophic. Before colonization, the indigenous population of North America may have been as high as 15 million. By 1900, that number had fallen to fewer than 300,000. Disease brought by Europeans, decades of warfare, forced relocations, and the calculated destruction of food sources, especially the buffalo, shattered countless tribes and nations. U.S. government policies relentlessly stripped native peoples of their lands, confining them to reservations often located in regions with poor soil and scarce resources. Even then, treaties meant to guarantee those territories were frequently broken whenever gold, silver, or other valuable resources were discovered. On top of this, a new wave of cultural violence unfolded as native children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase their heritage, operating under the chilling motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The popular Hollywood image of cowboys versus Indians bears little resemblance to reality. These simplistic stories erase the complexity of interactions between settlers and native nations. In truth, many native communities sought peaceful coexistence and worked to adapt to the changing world. Violence usually erupted only after repeated treaty violations, continued encroachment onto tribal lands, or outright acts of provocation. As your journey continues, you reflect on another group whose lives were far different than Hollywood often suggests: women on the frontier. Instead of helpless damsels or prim schoolmarms, frontier women carried crushing responsibilities, balancing grueling physical labor with the weight of restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women didn't just cook, clean, raise children, and sew clothes. They also worked the fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when danger came calling. Their days began before sunrise and stretched long past sunset, with little to no rest in between. A single day might see a woman plowing fields in the morning, helping deliver a neighbor's baby by midday, fending off predators threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still preparing meals and caring for her children late into the night. Because frontier life was so perilous, many women became widows while still young, forced to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite being essential to the survival of their families and communities, their legal rights remained limited. In most territories and states, married women couldn't vote, hold property in their own name, or even retain custody of their children if a marriage ended. Domestic violence, meanwhile, was treated as a private household matter, leaving victims with little to no protection under the law. For unmarried women, choices were painfully limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions available, but even there, women earned far less than their male counterparts and were often expected to resign the moment they married. Others carved out a measure of independence by running boarding houses, working as nurses, or opening small businesses like millinery shops and dressmaking services. And then there were the so-called soiled doves, women who ended up in prostitution, working out of frontier brothels and saloons. Later folklore sometimes romanticized these figures, but the truth was far darker. Many turned to sex work out of sheer desperation, often after being widowed, abandoned, or left without financial support. Their daily reality was one of constant danger, physical abuse, drug and alcohol dependency, and the spread of venereal disease. Even those who managed to earn significant money were rarely able to escape the stigma, facing social ostracism and few, if any, chances to move into more respectable roles. Still, the frontier wasn't entirely without opportunity. In some cases, women discovered greater freedom than they might have had back east. The scarcity of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options and, at times, better treatment, as towns actively sought to attract and keep female residents. A few territories, including Wyoming and Utah, even granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment, an acknowledgement of just how vital their contributions were to the survival and growth of frontier communities. As the day wears on and your journey continues, you might start to wonder about law enforcement in this land so often portrayed as lawless. The truth was far more complicated, varying drastically depending on where you were. Larger towns and cities usually had at least some form of organized law enforcement, but in the vast stretches of rural territory, official protection was often minimal or non-existent. County sheriffs, elected by local residents, were tasked with keeping the peace across enormous jurisdictions. In some cases, a single sheriff was responsible for thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. When trouble broke out, they often relied on deputizing ordinary citizens, forming posses to hunt down criminals or respond to outbreaks of violence. Within town limits, law enforcement usually fell to the town marshal, sometimes supported by a few deputies in bigger settlements. These roles were dangerous, poorly paid, and attracted a mix of personalities, some dedicated to public service, others drawn by the power a badge could bring. Even the famous lawmen of legend weren't always what they seemed. Figures like Wyatt Earp drifted in and out of legitimate law enforcement, sometimes blurring the line between justice and personal gain. At the federal level, U.S. Marshals had authority across states and territories, but they were few in number and focused mainly on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robberies, or offenses that crossed jurisdictions. The Hollywood image of lone U.S. Marshals riding into town to single-handedly tame chaos was more myth than reality. In remote regions where official law was absent, justice often fell to the community itself. Vigilante groups formed to deal with threats or punish wrongdoers. Sometimes they maintained a rough sense of order, but just as often they became tools for prejudice, personal grudges, or mob violence. The legendary quick-draw duel at high noon. That was mostly a creation of dime novels and Hollywood. On the actual frontier, violence was far less glamorous. Most of it was messy, impulsive, and often fueled by alcohol. Barroom brawls that spiraled out of control, acts of domestic violence, and bitter disputes over land or livestock claimed far more lives than the staged showdowns we see in movies. Punishment for crime was also far harsher than modern standards. Hanging was the go-to penalty, not only for murder or rape, but sometimes even for theft, especially horse or cattle rustling. Prisons did exist, but they were bleak, primitive places where disease, violence, and brutal conditions led to high death rates. For many communities, it was considered easier, and cheaper, to carry out an immediate execution than to deal with the burden of long-term imprisonment. As evening falls, you set out to find shelter for the night. If fortune's on your side, you might come across a town with a hotel or a boarding house. But don't expect comfort. Frontier accommodations were as bare bones as they come. A typical hotel room offered little more than a bed, often crawling with bedbugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and maybe a chair in the corner. Bathrooms were shared outhouses behind the building, used by every guest. Privacy was almost non-existent. Thin walls meant you could hear every cough, snore, or whispered conversation from the rooms around you. In busier places, it wasn't unusual to share a bed with a complete stranger, a common practice to squeeze in as many paying guests as possible. Clean sheets weren't guaranteed, and light came only from flickering candles or smoky oil lamps. The price for a night's lodging ranged anywhere from 25 cents to $1, depending on the location and quality. For many travelers, that was no small sum, the equivalent of several hours' hard labor. To save money, countless people opted to bed down in stables, barns, or out under the open sky, despite the very real risks of exposure, theft, or worse. If your travels took you through more remote country, chances were you'd camp for the night. That meant gathering enough fuel, never guaranteed on the open prairie, building a fire, cobbling together a meal from your meager supplies, and bedding down on the ground with little protection from the weather or the wildlife. Indigenous peoples, seasoned travelers, and military scouts developed highly skilled methods for safe camping. But for the average settler, inexperience often led to dangerous mistakes. Fire management was a matter of survival. Build it too large, and you risked igniting a prairie or forest fire that could rage out of control and consume thousands of acres within hours. Build it too small, and it might not keep you warm through a cold night, leaving you vulnerable to hypothermia. Cooking over that fire was its own challenge. Without proper skill, meals often ended up both charred and half raw at the same time, hardly appetizing, but still necessary. When night finally settled in, the darkness of the frontier was absolute. The sounds around you became sharper, coyotes howling in the distance, strange birds calling, the wind whispering through tall grass or trees. For those accustomed to the glow of streetlights and the hum of modern life, the silence and shadow of the wilderness could be deeply unsettling, sparking a primal kind of anxiety. On the frontier, many travelers slept poorly, not just from the hard ground or lumpy bedrolls, but from the gnawing fear of what might be waiting in the darkness. Though native attacks were rare, when they did occur they often came at dawn, striking when people were most vulnerable. Predators such as wolves, bears, or mountain lions sometimes prowled near camps in search of food. Venomous snakes or scorpions might crawl into a sleeper's blankets, drawn by the warmth of a human body. Even when no real danger appeared, the psychological weight of constant vigilance was exhausting. Frontier diaries speak again and again of bone-deep fatigue, not only from unending labor but from the mental strain of being perpetually on guard. For those of us accustomed to locked doors, alarm systems, and the protection of crowded neighborhoods, the sheer vulnerability of sleeping in the open wilderness would be profoundly unsettling. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the day's journey. Life on the trail bore almost no resemblance to the polished, romanticized versions later shown in books and films. It was grueling, uncomfortable, and filled with dangers most modern people could scarcely endure. The survival skills demanded: navigating without reliable maps, making emergency repairs, handling firearms safely, or simply managing fire and food, took years to master. Mistakes, no matter how small, were often fatal. The night deepens, and the sounds of unseen creatures echo louder across the darkness. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you make it through the night, you may push closer to your destination. Or perhaps you'll join the countless unmarked graves scattered along the trail, one more statistic in the perilous saga of westward expansion. The Wild West forgave no weakness. It offered no second chances. Each day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. And as the first light of dawn creeps across the horizon, you realize that simply waking up alive is triumph enough. You rub the sleep from your eyes, stretch your stiff muscles, and wonder what path your frontier journey will take today. Perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns, where legends claim fortunes can be made overnight. You've heard the stories of the California gold rush, Nevada's rich silver strikes, and Colorado's booming camps. Tales of ordinary men stumbling across nuggets the size of chicken eggs and walking away wealthy in an instant have lured hundreds of thousands west. But what those tales conveniently leave out are the brutal realities faced by most who chased mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually involve? The first step would be staking a claim, finding a piece of land that hadn't already been claimed and that might actually contain valuable deposits. By the 1870s, that was no small task. The richest, easiest to reach sites had been picked over years earlier. If you were fortunate enough to discover a promising spot, you need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, an expense that could quickly drain whatever little savings you had. Only then would the real work begin. And that, real work, was among the most physically punishing tasks you could imagine: placer mining, the hunt for loose gold in streams and riverbeds. Day after day, you'd spend endless hours hunched over in frigid mountain water, swirling sediment in a pan or feeding it through a crude sluice box. The icy current would leave your hands raw, cracked, and bleeding, while your back screamed from the constant, bent-over posture. And the payoff? More often than not, just a few glittering flakes of gold, barely enough to buy a meal. The dream of striking it rich was real for a few, but for the overwhelming majority, placer mining meant backbreaking labor that yielded little more than pennies. If you pushed beyond placer mining into hard rock mining, digging deep into the mountains for veins of ore, the dangers multiplied many times over. Without modern safety equipment or proper engineering, miners tunneled into unstable rock that frequently collapsed, crushing men instantly beneath tons of stone. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with invisible killers like carbon monoxide, an odorless gas that suffocated its victims without warning. And then there was blasting. To break through solid rock, miners relied on black powder or dynamite, tools as dangerous as the terrain itself. Charges misfired or went off too soon, taking fingers, hands, eyes, or entire lives. Even successful blasts turned the air into a storm of flying rock fragments, each one a deadly projectile. The deafening roar and constant percussion left countless miners with permanent hearing loss. And that was just the immediate danger. The long-term toll was just as brutal. Fine rock dust filled the lungs, leading to silicosis, a slow, suffocating disease that strangled its victims from within. Mercury used in gold processing poisoned the nervous system, causing tremors and mental decline. Those laboring in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals into their bodies, inviting chronic illness and premature death. By the 1870s, the mining industry operated with virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners cared first and foremost about profit, treating injuries and deaths as an inevitable cost of doing business. For the workers, that meant disaster was always just one accident away. Medical care for the injured was crude at best, and a serious injury almost always ended a miner's career. With no disability benefits or workers' compensation, many were left destitute after a single mishap. And what was the reward for all this risk and hardship? Despite the popular myth of the lucky prospector striking it rich, the reality was far bleaker. By this time, most miners were no longer independent fortune seekers but wage laborers for large mining companies. Their pay ranged from $2 to $3 for grueling shifts that stretched 10 to 12 hours underground. Ironically, the real money in mining towns rarely went to the men in the shafts. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes often earned far more than the miners themselves, living off the hopes and desperation of those chasing dreams buried deep in the rock. Mining towns of the 19th century were among the roughest communities on the frontier. Picture it, settlements filled almost entirely with young, single men engaged in exhausting, dangerous labor, with few women, families, or stabilizing institutions to temper the atmosphere. Alcohol flowed freely, and in staggering quantities. The average mining camp resident drank several times more than the typical American does today. Fueled by liquor and frustration, violence was a constant presence. Fistfights, stabbings, and shootings erupted regularly, making law and order fragile at best. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. With little planning or infrastructure, human waste and garbage piled up in the streets and seeped into waterways. Outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread quickly under such conditions. In the summer heat, the stench became overwhelming. All swarms of flies carried disease from waste to whatever food people managed to scrounge. Even if you were fortunate enough to strike valuable ore, turning it into actual money was another ordeal entirely. Banking on the frontier was primitive at best, and often outright predatory. Many mining towns didn't have banks at all, leaving miners no choice but to carry their gold dust or raw ore with them, making them prime targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but usually at unfair prices, exploiting miners who had no better options. Where banks did exist, they operated with little regulation and almost no oversight. Failures were frequent, wiping out the life savings of entire communities overnight with no chance of recovery. Many so-called bankers were nothing more than con men who opened storefronts, collected deposits, and then vanished, taking every cent with them. The currency system only added to the chaos. With no federally backed paper money, individual banks issued their own notes, and the value of each depended entirely on that bank's reputation. Counterfeiting was rampant, and even experienced merchants sometimes struggled to tell genuine bills from clever fakes. Gold and silver coins were the most reliable form of money, but carrying them painted a target squarely on your back for robbers. Perhaps, after weighing all these dangers and disappointments, you'd decide to leave mining behind and try your hand at ranching instead. By the 1870s, the cattle industry was booming. With eastern cities hungry for beef, the frontier seemed full of opportunity. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable path than mining. And while ranching did avoid some of the deadly health hazards of the mines, it came with its own set of dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required enormous capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all demanded major investments. Many would-be ranchers sank deep into debt just to get started, gambling everything on the hope that weather and markets would cooperate. More often than not, nature had other plans. Droughts could strip the land bare, leaving cattle without food or water. Harsh winters sometimes devastated entire herds. During the infamous Great Die-Off of 1886 to 87, up to 90% of the cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death in a single season. Diseases like Texas fever and anthrax had no effective cures in the 1870s, and an outbreak could wipe out a rancher's livelihood almost overnight. And then there were the predators. Wolves, cougars, and other animals constantly preyed on livestock, especially calves. Even plants and landscapes posed dangers, poisonous weeds, patches of quicksand, or injuries suffered on the open range all chipped away at herds. The legendary cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad depots, were anything but romantic adventures. Far from the glamorous cowboys of later films, the real drovers were usually young, poorly paid laborers enduring grueling, dangerous work. On the trail, they often worked 20-hour days, stealing brief naps in the saddle while guiding thousands of animals across harsh and unforgiving terrain. The dangers were constant. River crossings could turn deadly in an instant if cattle panicked, creating massive pileups that drowned both animals and riders. Stampedes were even more terrifying, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a lightning strike or the snap of a twig. In seconds, thousands of half-ton animals could surge into an unstoppable wall of destruction, trampling anything in their path. Cowboys caught in the chaos rarely survived. Life on the trail bore little resemblance to the freedom-filled myths. A cowboy's pay averaged around $30 a month, a meager wage for such exhausting labor. Most were very young, often teenagers from poor families with few alternatives. A significant share were black, Mexican, or mixed-race cowhands who faced constant discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere, even as their work kept the cattle industry alive. Meals on the trail were monotonous: beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with fresh food almost non-existent. Medical care was equally scarce, often limited to whatever folk remedies the camp cook happened to know. Injuries from the dangerous work were common, and untreated wounds or infections frequently proved fatal. Many cowboys never lived to see old age, their lives cut short by accidents, exposure, or violence. So maybe ranching doesn't sound appealing after all. What about farming? Surely, the act of growing food, the most basic human endeavor, would offer a more stable, less dangerous life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised just that. It opened millions of acres in the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. On paper, it sounded like a dream, an incredible chance for families of modest means to become independent landowners and build a future of their own. But the reality proved far harsher than the promise. While 160 acres seemed generous, in the arid regions that made up much of the available land, it was often nowhere near enough to sustain a family. Farming methods brought from the east failed miserably in places where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were used to. Few settlers knew the dryland farming techniques required to coax crops from the parched soil. Even before planting a single seed, homesteaders faced backbreaking work. The first priority was shelter, usually a sod house on the treeless plains. These soddies were built by cutting and stacking thick blocks of prairie turf. Though functional, they were dark, damp, and prone to leaking whenever it rained. Insects and even snakes often found their way inside, and without constant upkeep, the walls crumbled back into the earth. Only after shelter was secured could the truly punishing task begin: breaking the land for planting. The prairie sod itself posed the first great challenge. Held together by dense root systems that had built up over centuries, it was nearly impossible to break with the simple plows most settlers owned. Preparing even a few acres for planting could take a year or more, and the strain left many farmers with permanent injuries, aching backs, ruined joints, and bodies worn down before their time. And once crops were finally in the ground, the threats never stopped. Droughts could wither plants before they reached maturity. Torrential rains washed away seedlings or flooded entire fields. An early frost might kill a crop just days before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in swarms so vast they seemed biblical, devouring every green thing in sight, sometimes even chewing through the wooden handles of tools left in the fields. Illness was another constant danger, with consequences that could be catastrophic. Unlike in larger towns, most farm families had no hired help or community safety net. If sickness struck during planting or harvest season, the result could be the difference between survival and starvation. Women often had no choice but to keep working in the fields while heavily pregnant, or even just days after giving birth, putting their lives and health at serious risk. Accidents were all too common and often fatal. Crude, homemade tools broke under strain, causing terrible injuries. Panicked animals trampled their handlers. Even success carried danger. Grain storage bins could become deadly traps, suffocating farmers who slipped inside, while poorly built storage sheds sometimes collapsed under the crushing weight of their contents. The isolation of frontier farms carried a crushing psychological burden. Neighbors were often miles away, and visits were rare. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of this loneliness, sometimes going months without speaking to anyone outside their own household. The silence and solitude wore people down. Depression, anxiety, and what settlers grimly called prairie madness were common afflictions, leading in some cases to abandoned homesteads, or even suicide. And for those who endured the hardships long enough to actually raise a crop, new challenges emerged. Selling that harvest was no simple task. Getting goods to market was slow and expensive, especially without reliable transportation. Perishable food spoiled quickly without refrigeration, forcing families to sell fast or find ways to preserve what they could. On top of that, powerful agricultural corporations and railroad companies manipulated the system to their advantage, keeping crop prices low while charging steep rates for transportation. Independent farmers were squeezed from both ends, working themselves to exhaustion only to find their profits vanish. By the 1870s, a new frontier option was emerging: wage labor in the growing towns and industries. On the surface, this seemed safer and more stable than the high-risk gambles of mining, ranching, or farming. And while working for wages did avoid some of the crushing financial risks of independent ventures, it came with its own harsh realities. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Factory and mill workers faced horrific injuries from unguarded machinery, with fingers, limbs, and lives lost in an instant. Construction crews raised ever taller buildings without harnesses or protective gear, and fatal falls were a routine occurrence. Railroad work was especially deadly. Track layers labored under brutal conditions with minimal equipment, enduring exhaustion, heat stroke, and accidents that claimed countless lives. Chinese immigrants, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were frequently assigned the most perilous jobs, like handling unstable explosives to blast through mountains, tasks that killed many outright. The hours were punishing: 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages so low most workers barely scraped by. Children as young as 8 or 9 toiled alongside adults, their small size and inexperience leading to even higher injury rates. And in terms of rights, workers had none. Employers could slash wages, withhold pay, or fire employees without cause. Those who dared to protest or attempt to organize for better conditions risked being blacklisted, branded as troublemakers that no other employer in the region would touch. Company towns became a defining feature of certain frontier industries, especially in mining and lumber regions. In these settlements, a single employer owned nearly everything: housing, stores, and sometimes even the churches and schools. Workers often had no choice but to shop at the company store, where prices were inflated far beyond reason. Many were even paid in scrip, a form of company-issued currency that wasn't legal tender anywhere else. The result was a system of debt bondage, workers trapped in a cycle where saving enough to leave was nearly impossible. No matter what path you chose, mining, ranching, farming, or wage labor, frontier life reshaped existence in ways modern people would find almost alien. Perhaps the most striking difference was the relationship with time itself. In our digital age, life is carved into minutes and hours, measured by clocks and schedules. On the frontier, time flowed according to daylight, seasons, and the demands of nature. Without electric light, most people rose at dawn and went to bed shortly after sunset, their waking hours stretching or shrinking with the seasons. Work wasn't organized into neat 8-hour shifts, it was defined by tasks. A field needed plowing, cattle had to be moved, or had to be hauled from the earth. During harvests or cattle roundups, people might labor from first light until long after dark for weeks on end. In contrast, winter often brought stretches of forced idleness, when frozen fields or dormant herds required only minimal attention. The modern obsession with punctuality had little place on the frontier. With few clocks and little need for precision in daily life, people moved on looser schedules. Time was marked not in minutes and hours, but in broader strokes. Morning, afternoon, or after supper, was usually specific enough. Only stagecoaches and, later, trains imposed stricter timetables, gradually introducing the West to the concept of standardized schedules. Leisure and entertainment looked very different from what we know today. After long, exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had neither the energy nor the resources for elaborate amusements. Evenings were often spent gathered around a fire, talking, telling stories, or playing simple card games. When instruments were available, music became a favorite diversion, fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing the soundtrack for lively community dances. Reading material was scarce and treasured. A single book might circulate through an entire settlement, read aloud to neighbors or passed from family to family until the pages fell apart. Newspapers, when they arrived, were pored over repeatedly, every advertisement and small notice examined for news of the wider world. Sports and games existed, but in humble forms. Baseball was spreading westward, often played with minimal equipment on rough, makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling matches, and shooting contests provided not just entertainment but also a chance to showcase valuable frontier skills. Children invented their own fun with what little they had, games of tag, hide and seek, or improvised versions of stickball played with whatever objects could be found. Holidays and community celebrations carried enormous weight on the frontier. There were rare moments when isolation gave way to fellowship, and neighbors traveled miles to gather together. On the 4th of July, entire communities might come together for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing that stretched long into the evening. Harvest festivals marked the successful end of the year's most vital work, while religious holidays offered both spiritual meaning and much-needed breaks from the grind of daily survival. As the day fades, you reflect on the relentless demands of frontier life. Everything required harder work, carried greater risks, and offered fewer comforts than anything we know today. Those who endured, and even thrived, did so because they possessed qualities modern society rarely asks for: extraordinary physical stamina, an arsenal of practical skills for endless emergencies, and a resilience strong enough to withstand constant hardship, grief, and uncertainty. Night deepens, and the silence settles in. No engines rumbling, no electronics humming, no neon buzzing in the distance. Just the whisper of the wind, the chirp of insects, and the occasional cry of a night bird. To modern ears, this profound quiet might feel unsettling, even oppressive. But for those who lived it, this was the soundtrack of the frontier, sometimes peaceful, sometimes lonely, always inescapable. As you drift towards sleep, one last thought lingers. Would you have had what it takes to survive here? Not for a day or a week, but for years, decades, in a world where every sunrise brought new trials and survival itself was never guaranteed. The people who shaped the American West, both for better and for worse, were not the flawless heroes of dime novels or Hollywood films. They were complex, imperfect individuals, struggling to endure extraordinary hardships with only the limited knowledge and resources of their time. Stripped of romanticism, their story is one of raw human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a heavy blanket, and above, the stars blaze with a brilliance that modern eyes, dulled by light pollution, rarely glimpse. This was one pure gift the frontier offered, an unbroken view of the cosmos. The Milky Way stretched in a luminous arc across the sky, connecting settlers to the same vast panorama their ancestors had gazed upon for countless generations. But dawn always came, and with it, hunger, the constant companion of life on the frontier. Food in the 1870s bore little resemblance to the variety and convenience of the modern diet. So what did it actually take to keep yourself fed in such a harsh environment? The good news was that game was still abundant in many regions. Deer, elk, rabbits, and birds could supplement a family's table, if you had the skill to hunt them. The bad news was that hunting required ammunition, which was expensive, and every shot spent on food was one less saved for protection. Hunting also demanded time away from other pressing chores, making it a luxury many settlers could not afford during busy seasons. For most families, survival depended heavily on what they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The backbone of the frontier diet came down to three staples: beans, corn, and pork. Calorie-dense, yes, but monotonous, and far from nutritionally complete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a rare treat, available only during brief growing seasons. For much of the winter, families went months without a single bite of fresh produce. This lack of variety carried a heavy cost. Nutritional deficiencies were widespread. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common scourge during the long winters and early spring months. Settlers knew its painful symptoms all too well: bleeding gums, teeth loosening in their sockets, swollen joints, and eventually death if left unchecked. And scurvy wasn't the only issue. Other deficiencies stunted children's growth and left adults battling chronic ailments that few understood at the time. Preserving food was both an essential survival skill and a daily challenge. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly or treated to last longer. Smoking, salting, and drying could keep it edible, but these methods stripped away flavor, altered texture, and often reduced nutritional value. The heavy salt content of preserved food also contributed to long-term health problems like high blood pressure. Much of this burden fell on women, who spent countless hours preserving what food they could during times of plenty to prepare for lean months. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented for storage. Fruits were dried or preserved with sugar when it was available. Hardy root vegetables were tucked away in root cellars, cool underground storage spaces designed to stretch supplies through the harsh winter. On the frontier, preserving food wasn't a side task, it was essential survival work. A family's ability to endure the winter often depended on how well they had prepared their stores. Properly preserved foods could last for months, sometimes even years. But mistakes in technique led to spoilage, and worse, to deadly cases of food poisoning. Even when done correctly, food storage brought constant problems. Pests were inevitable. Rats, mice, and insects invaded supplies, consuming portions and contaminating the rest. Most families learned to accept a grim reality. Flour, beans, and other staples often contained insect parts or rodent droppings, and removing them completely was impossible. Cooking itself demanded far more labor than most modern people can imagine. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that required endless attention and a steady supply of fuel. On the treeless prairies, women and children sometimes spent hours collecting buffalo chips, twisted grass, or other makeshift fuels to keep the fire burning. Water had to be hauled in heavy buckets from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds each day, just to meet the demands of cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with all that effort, frontier meals remained plain and repetitive. Spices were expensive luxuries, used sparingly if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured, hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow, and only during the months it was producing. For most children growing up on the frontier, diets were simple, repetitive, and nutritionally bare, a far cry from the variety modern nutritionists would consider essential. Interestingly, despite the plain diets and limited variety, obesity was virtually unheard of on the frontier. The constant physical labor, scarce food supplies, and low sugar intake kept most people lean. But this thinness wasn't the picture of health, it often masked widespread malnutrition. Many settlers consumed enough calories to keep working, but lacked the nutrients needed to stay truly healthy. Beyond the daily fight for food, frontier families faced another immense challenge: raising children in this harsh environment. Had you been born in the Wild West rather than just visiting it, your childhood would have looked nothing like what you know today. In the 19th century, childhood itself was understood differently. By the age of 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute meaningful work, not as light chores to build character, but as vital labor that kept their families alive. Little ones tended livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, hauled water, watched over younger siblings, and handled countless small but essential tasks that freed adults for heavier work. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children labored alongside adults at nearly full capacity. Boys followed their fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning through hands-on experience rather than formal instruction. Girls worked closely with their mothers, not just tidying the home but mastering the demanding skills of frontier homemaking, spinning and sewing clothing, preserving food, rendering candles, even making soap. These weren't hobbies. They were survival skills. On the frontier, adulthood arrived early, and it extended into every part of life. Frontier children were not shielded from life's harshest realities. They grew up witnessing births and deaths, the slaughtering of animals, and even the violence that sometimes erupted in their communities. Rather than being protected, they were expected to accept and adapt to these experiences as a natural part of life. Education, at least in the way we think of it today, was limited and inconsistent. In more established towns, schools might run for only a few months each year, typically in the winter, when children weren't needed for farm work. A single teacher, often with little more education than the older students, was responsible for pupils ranging in age from 5 to 17, all packed into one room. Conditions were far from ideal. Schoolhouses were poorly insulated, leaving students shivering in the winter and sweltering in the summer. Supplies were scarce. Perhaps a few worn textbooks shared among dozens of children, slates that had to be endlessly erased and reused, and just enough paper to be treated like treasure. Discipline was harsh. Corporal punishment was the standard, with whippings or beatings handed out for offenses as minor as whispering, fidgeting, or failing to memorize assigned lessons. In more remote areas, there were no schools at all. Some families tried to provide home instruction using whatever books they had, but many frontier children received only the barest literacy and arithmetic skills, if that. For most, education came not from the classroom but from the necessities of daily life, practical knowledge, survival skills, and the responsibilities of adulthood thrust upon them from an early age. For children, survival skills were often as important as reading or arithmetic. They learned how to predict the weather, track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and handle the countless other tasks that kept families alive. But even with such knowledge, childhood on the frontier was perilous. Child mortality remained heartbreakingly high. Roughly 1 in 4 children never reached adulthood, with the first 5 years of life the most dangerous. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or left children permanently disabled. Accidents claimed many more. Safety precautions were virtually non-existent in a world where survival required constant risk-taking. The psychological toll of such loss is almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. Most frontier children grew up watching siblings die, while parents lived with the grim expectation that not all of their children would survive. It was common practice to reuse the name of a deceased child for a later sibling, a tradition that feels unsettling today but reflected a different relationship with mortality in a time when death was a daily companion. Nothing illustrates the gulf between frontier and modern life more starkly than health and medicine. If you fell ill or suffered an injury in the 1870s West, your experience would look nothing like modern healthcare. The first and most obvious difference was the absence of professional medical care. Doctors were scarce. Many communities had none at all, and those who did practice often had only the barest training, perhaps a short apprenticeship, or a few months at a medical college. The medical knowledge of the 1870s reflected the limited science of the era, still grounded in outdated theories like humoral balance, ideas with more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. With professional doctors scarce, most health problems were handled at home through folk remedies and community healers, often women who carried on traditions passed down through different cultures. Some of these treatments, especially certain herbal remedies, genuinely helped. But many others were ineffective, or actively harmful. Bloodletting, for example, was still common, leaving already weak patients even more frail. Purges were used to cleanse the body of bad humors, but instead caused violent diarrhea that further dehydrated the sick. Poultices of various substances were slapped onto wounds, but some did more harm than good, introducing infection rather than preventing it. One of the most widely used treatments was laudanum, a tincture of opium prescribed for pain, coughs, or even restlessness. It dulled symptoms, but also led to widespread addiction. Mercury compounds were prescribed for everything from constipation to venereal disease, despite their obvious toxicity. Even remedies that might have worked were undermined by impure or inconsistent ingredients. With no pharmaceutical regulations or standardization, medicines varied wildly in strength and often carried dangerous contaminants. Patent medicines, those miracle cure-alls, advertised in newspapers and on traveling wagons, were especially notorious. Many consisted mostly of alcohol, offering nothing more than temporary relief through intoxication rather than any real treatment. Surgery under frontier conditions was nothing short of horrific. With no effective anesthesia beyond whiskey, alcohol, or perhaps a dose of opium, patients endured operations in excruciating pain, often held down by friends or family. Sterilization was either unknown or only inconsistently practiced, which meant post-surgical infections were rampant. Amputation became the default response to serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped clean but never truly sterilized. Survival was far from guaranteed. Childbirth, however, may have represented the starkest divide between frontier life and modern medicine. Most women gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or simply by female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, complications weren't recognized until labor was already underway. Breech births, hemorrhages, and other emergencies that modern doctors manage with routine interventions often ended in tragedy for the mother, the child, or both. The maternal mortality rate on the frontier was staggering, about 1 death for every 100 births, over 100 times higher than in developed nations today. For many women, each pregnancy carried the very real fear that it might be their last. Men's diaries and letters from the period often speak with heartbreaking frankness about being left to raise children alone after a wife died in childbirth. The combination of poor nutrition, constant physical strain, almost no preventive care, and primitive treatment methods left frontier communities with health outcomes more like those of developing nations today than anything resembling modern America. Life expectancy at birth on the frontier was under 40 years. For those who survived childhood, reaching 50 often meant living with chronic pain, illness, or disability, if they made it that far at all. But beyond physical hardships, frontier life carried another heavy burden: isolation. For people used to the instant connections of today's world, the loneliness of the frontier would feel almost unbearable. Communication moved only as fast as the horses, wagons, or trains that carried it. Letters took weeks or even months to reach their destination, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often distorted in the retelling, so that major events might not become known in remote areas until long after they had passed. This constant information lag fostered a deeply localized worldview, where the struggles of one's immediate community felt pressing and real, while distant events seemed vague and irrelevant. For many, the isolation was hardest of all. Women who had grown up surrounded by family and close female friendships often found themselves utterly alone for days or weeks while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries speak of crippling loneliness and the mental strain of going without adult conversation for long stretches of time. This loneliness, combined with endless labor and the harsh environment, sometimes pushed people past their breaking point. Contemporary accounts described prairie madness, severe depression, crushing anxiety, and even episodes of psychosis brought on by the isolation and hardship of frontier life. For some, the psychological strain of frontier life became unbearable. Affected individuals sometimes turned violent against their own families, while others took their own lives. Many simply gave up, abandoning their homesteads and retreating back east, unable to endure the crushing isolation and relentless hardships. Even in more established settlements, social life was limited by practical barriers. Visiting a neighbor might mean walking or riding several miles each way, a significant effort when time was precious and transportation was scarce. Formal gatherings were rare, usually tied to church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings and harvest festivals. Churches, in particular, became the heart of frontier communities. They were more than houses of worship. They served as social centers, schools, and mutual aid networks. Even those with little personal faith often took part in church life simply for the sense of connection it offered. Religious leaders, whether ministers, priests, or lay preachers, were more than spiritual guides. They were teachers, mediators, and community organizers, helping weave together the fragile fabric of frontier society. The creation of community institutions marked a turning point in a settlement's evolution. Building a school, a church, or a meeting hall signaled a shift from temporary exploitation of resources to a vision of permanence. These institutions transformed rough mining camps or trading posts into true towns, places with collective identities, shared responsibilities, and the beginnings of a future. The formation of local governments, rudimentary though they often were, marked another step in the transition from raw frontier chaos to settled community. Alongside these emerging institutions, frontier towns developed distinctive traditions of mutual aid and collective action, born of necessity in such unforgiving conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings brought neighbors together to complete construction projects no single family could manage alone. During harvest, teams of workers rotated from farm to farm, ensuring that everyone's crops were gathered before storms or frost could wipe them out. When a child went missing, entire communities dropped what they were doing to form search parties, knowing that swift cooperation could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. These cooperative practices reflected a fundamental truth: despite the popular myth of rugged self-reliance, no one survived the frontier entirely alone. Day-to-day endurance required independence and resourcefulness, yes, but larger challenges demanded collective effort. This balance, between individual self-reliance and community interdependence, shaped frontier culture and still echoes through American attitudes toward government, community, and personal responsibility. And so, as another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you reflect on the extraordinary resilience, mental, physical, and emotional, required to endure such a life year after year. The men and women of the frontier were not superhuman. They suffered. They struggled. And some broke beneath the relentless weight of their environment. But many adapted, persevered, and even discovered meaning, sometimes joy, amid the hardship. Darkness settles once again, bringing with it the profound silence of a pre-industrial night. The day's journey has offered you a glimpse into a world that feels both strangely familiar and utterly foreign. A world where survival demanded constant vigilance. Where comfort was rare and luxury almost unheard of. Where death was not a distant concept but a constant companion. As sleep draws near, questions linger. What compelled these people to choose such a life, or forced them into it by circumstance? What sustained them through blizzards, droughts, disease, and loss? And what would they think if they could see the world their struggles helped create? A world of abundance, convenience, and security beyond anything they could have imagined. A world built upon the foundations of their labor, their resilience, and their sacrifices. These questions follow you into dreams filled with endless prairies and towering mountains, haunted by the faces of those who endured the Wild West. They did not tame it with romantic gunfights or cinematic showdowns, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, remains a testament to human adaptability, and to the extraordinary courage of ordinary people confronting extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. As golden light spills across the horizon, you pause to take in the raw beauty that drew so many people westward. Despite the dangers and hardships, the frontier was also a place of breathtaking grandeur, endless prairies rolling like oceans, jagged mountains piercing the sky, and vast canyons plunging deep into the earth. This beauty, at least, was no Hollywood invention. Yet even this relationship with the natural world differed profoundly from modern environmental perspectives. To most settlers, nature was not something to be preserved or protected. It was a resource to be conquered, consumed, and reshaped. Forests were cut without thought of regrowth. Game was hunted to the brink of extinction. Streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed by mining operations, with little concern for those downstream. Perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative mentality was the near eradication of the American bison. In the 1700s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed the North American plains. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This wasn't just the result of overhunting for food or hides, though that played its part. It was also deliberate policy, encouraged by the U.S. government, as a means of breaking the resistance of Plains Indian tribes by destroying their most vital resource. General Philip Sheridan, one of the leading commanders in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly remarked, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not General Sheridan actually uttered those words, they perfectly captured the government's mindset at the time. The systematic destruction of the buffalo herds amounted to environmental warfare, designed not only to clear land for settlement but to shatter the foundation of Plains Indian life. For native nations across the West, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of an apocalypse. It meant more than displacement from ancestral lands. It meant the collapse of entire economic systems, the suppression of spiritual practices, and the dismantling of cultural identities that had been tied for millennia to specific landscapes and resources. While some early encounters between settlers and native peoples involved trade and limited cooperation, by the 1870s most indigenous communities faced impossible choices: confinement on reservations, resistance against overwhelming odds, or assimilation into a culture determined to erase their own. The reservation system itself amounted to cultural genocide. Native children were torn from their families and sent to boarding schools intended to, in the words of Captain Richard H. Pratt, "kill the Indian and save the man." At places like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, children had their hair cut short, their languages forbidden, their religions suppressed, and their cultural identities systematically stripped away. The scars of these policies did not fade. Their intergenerational trauma continues to weigh heavily on Native communities even today. Armed resistance against American expansion almost always ended in eventual defeat, though some nations managed to hold on to independence longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, was one of the last major indigenous victories against U.S. forces. But the aftermath brought devastating consequences. In response, the U.S. military launched increasingly brutal campaigns, attacking villages, destroying food stores, and killing women and children in a relentless effort to break native resistance. The tragedy of this cultural collision is underscored by what was lost. Many native nations possessed sophisticated agricultural systems, complex forms of governance, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable insights to European settlers. Yet fundamental misunderstandings fueled conflict, none more significant than the differing concept of land ownership. For many native groups, the very idea of owning land was inconceivable. Land was sacred and communal, as impossible to own as the air or the stars. Treaty negotiations over territory were, from the outset, built on irreconcilable assumptions. And the cultural conflicts of the frontier extended far beyond relations between native peoples and white settlers. The West was an extraordinarily diverse place, home to immigrants and communities from around the world. Different languages, religions, and customs brought fresh skills and perspectives, enriching the frontier. But diversity also sparked tension in towns already strained by scarce resources and limited infrastructure. Chinese immigrants, who had been instrumental in building the transcontinental railroad and advancing mining operations, faced especially harsh discrimination. They were welcomed as essential labor when needed, then scapegoated and driven out when times grew lean. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law to restrict immigration based on nationality, emerged from decades of anti-Chinese hostility in the West. Long before the law, Chinese miners were pushed off rich claims through violence or by discriminatory foreign miners' taxes, designed to drive them out. In frontier towns, entire Chinese communities faced riots, arson, and mass expulsions whenever economic conditions soured. Mexican Americans, many of whom had become U.S. citizens not through immigration but through territorial annexation after the Mexican-American War, faced similar discrimination and dispossession. Though treaties had promised to protect their property rights, countless Mexican landowners lost their holdings through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. Traditional Spanish-derived water rights systems, carefully adapted to arid climates, were dismantled and replaced with English common law doctrines, systems far less suited to the realities of the West. Even European immigrants, despite being closer to the Anglo-American majority, often found their national and religious identities marked them as outsiders. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews each formed distinct communities where they preserved language, faith, and cultural practices from their homelands. These enclaves provided essential mutual support in the harsh conditions of the frontier. But they also became lightning rods for nativist hostility whenever economic or social tensions flared. After the Civil War, many African Americans looked westward, hoping to escape the crushing weight of Southern oppression. But while the frontier offered new opportunities, it also revealed new forms of discrimination. Black cowboys, who made up as much as a quarter of the workforce on some cattle operations, rarely received recognition in contemporary accounts, and were almost entirely erased from later myths of the West. Black homesteaders, too, established resilient communities across several Western territories. Yet they often faced organized resistance from white neighbors, along with discriminatory enforcement of homestead laws that undermined their claims to land and security. The West was never the simple, heroic landscape of later stories. Instead, it was a collision of diverse groups, each carrying their own traditions, values, and expectations. This created frontier communities that were far more complex and more conflicted than the romantic depictions of dime novels or Hollywood films. The melting pot metaphor, later celebrated in American mythology, glossed over both the persistence of cultural distinctiveness and the stark power imbalances that determined whose traditions would survive and whose would be suppressed. By the 1870s and 1880s, the frontier itself was transforming. Individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale entrepreneurs were giving way to corporate power and industrial expansion, The arrival of the railroads accelerated this shift more than anything else. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, travel time between east and west collapsed from months to mere days, reshaping the entire pace of frontier life. In the years following the completion of the Transcontinental Line, a web of branch railroads pushed into regions once considered unreachable, linking remote settlements to the national marketplace. This transportation revolution transformed the West. It allowed the large-scale extraction of natural resources, minerals, timber, cattle, grain, for shipment to eastern factories, while mass-produced goods from the east flooded back into western towns and homesteads. These new economic connections sped up the integration of the frontier into national systems, but they often came at the expense of small producers. Independent miners could no longer compete with powerful corporations that brought in industrial machinery and capital investment. Family farms were increasingly overshadowed by agricultural enterprises working thousands of acres. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed out by massive cattle companies backed by wealthy investors and political connections. Corporate power didn't just dominate the economy, it shaped politics as well. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders wielded enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Decisions about water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were rarely made with small operators or local communities in mind. Instead, they typically favored those with the deepest pockets and the strongest political ties. The West's transition from raw frontier to integrated region was more than economic, it was cultural. Rough-and-tumble mining camps and cattle towns slowly acquired institutions that signaled permanence: banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. These developments connected frontier settlements to the wider currents of American society, transforming them from temporary outposts into communities with shared futures. As frontier towns matured, their appearance and governance changed dramatically. Streets were surveyed, graded, and in some cases even paved. Wooden shacks gave way to sturdier brick and stone buildings. Local governments began passing ordinances to regulate behaviors that once went unchecked: curfews, gambling restrictions, liquor laws, and bans on carrying firearms within town limits. For many settlers who had been drawn west precisely to escape the rules and restraints of the East, these changes felt like the unwanted domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some responded by packing up and moving farther westward, always chasing the next frontier. Others stayed, but struggled to adjust to the growing web of regulation, competition, and social expectations. The mythic end of the frontier, announced by the 1890 census, reflected more than a statistical change. It was a cultural and psychological shift for those whose very identity had been tied to frontier conditions. What had once been a world defined by individual freedom, improvisation, and raw survival was now giving way to permanence, institutions, and law. The myths that grew around frontier figures blurred and often erased the complicated, morally ambiguous truths of their lives. Wild Bill Hickok, far from the flawless marksman of legend, killed bystanders in at least 2 of his gunfights. Wyatt Earp's career was not that of a straightforward lawman but a patchwork of roles: sheriff, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante, shifting as opportunity demanded. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his background as a Confederate guerrilla and the innocent people who died in his robberies. As evening settles on your final day in the Wild West, you reflect on this widening gap between reality and myth. Why did Americans, and eventually the world, become so captivated by a romanticized version of such a brutal, unforgiving era? What needs did these myths fulfill, and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most feverish wave of frontier myth-making arrived just as the actual frontier was vanishing. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows, beginning in the 1880s, staged dramatized versions of Indian battles, stagecoach robberies, and frontier heroics for eager Eastern audiences. These performances weren't meant to provide historical accuracy. They were entertainment, shaped to satisfy Eastern imaginations about what the West should have been, rather than what it truly was. At the same time, dime novels flooded the market, filled with exaggerated adventures of outlaws and heroes. These stories weren't born on the frontier itself, but in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who often had little or no first-hand experience of the lands and people they described. Yet for millions of readers, these tales became the truth about the West. The formula was simple but powerful. These stories emphasized non-stop action, sharp moral divides between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as the ultimate proving ground for American virtues, self-reliance, courage, and rugged individualism. Later, Hollywood westerns took those same elements and polished them into something even more enduring. The lone cowboy riding into the sunset, the fearless sheriff standing tall, the dastardly outlaw lurking in the shadows, and the caricature of the savage Indian. All iconic images, but ones with little grounding in historical reality. These myths served deeper purposes than entertainment. They provided Americans with reassuring narratives during times of rapid social change and mounting international challenges. The frontier was cast as the crucible in which American identity had been forged, producing exceptional qualities that supposedly set the nation apart from the old societies of Europe and beyond. Expansion across the continent was framed as not only inevitable, but morally righteous, civilization triumphing over wilderness, progress conquering primitive cultures. In this mythology, good always prevailed through righteous violence. It was a narrative that justified America's rising global power, military, economic, and cultural, by rooting it in the supposed lessons of the West. But these myths also cast deep shadows. They obscured the uncomfortable realities of Western development, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the domination of politics by corporate interests, and the fractious communities wrestling with profound questions of identity, governance, and survival. The real West offered no neat moral lessons. Instead, it stood as a case study in how human societies adapt under pressure, sometimes displaying extraordinary cooperation and creativity, other times collapsing into exploitation, violence, and brutality. As darkness falls once again, you pause to reflect on this unvarnished journey through the Wild West. It becomes clear why most people today, surrounded by abundant food, modern medicine, physical safety, and comforts undreamed of in the 1870s, would struggle to survive even a single day in those conditions. The skills, knowledge, physical endurance, and psychological resilience required for frontier life represent a way of being so distant from modern experience that it borders on the unimaginable. And yet, the frontier still captivates us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a world stripped to essentials, where every task carried immediate consequences and every achievement marked a tangible victory against nature's limits. Perhaps it's the sense of community forged under hardship, where survival demanded cooperation across differences of culture, language, or belief. Or perhaps it's simply the enduring reminder that human beings can endure, and even find meaning, in conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. The true legacy of the American frontier lies not only in the myths that reshaped it, but also in the systems, institutions, and cultural attitudes it left behind, structures that continue to shape American life to this very day. Property laws, water rights systems, federal, state relationships, and approaches to natural resources. All of these cornerstones of American governance grew out of frontier-era conflicts and compromises. The diversity of frontier communities, despite the heavy hand of forced assimilation, laid the groundwork for the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the tensions that continued to shape national debates, between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and federal oversight, exploitation and conservation, traced their roots back to the frontier. For indigenous peoples, however, The frontier era was not a triumphant saga of national expansion, but a catastrophe. It marked the devastation of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues to this day. Their perspective reminds us that the triumphalist narrative of settlement erases the sophisticated civilizations that already existed here, and it diminishes the incalculable knowledge lost in their disruption. To understand the frontier honestly, we must hold multiple truths at once, acknowledging the courage and resilience of those who carved out new lives in hostile conditions, while also facing the destruction and displacement experienced by those pushed aside in the process. And so, as you drift to sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of that earlier America settle around you, the whisper of wind through the tall prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps even the faint strains of a piano drifting from a saloon down the street. These sensory threads, fragile, fleeting, were shared by all who lived in that time, binding together lives that otherwise stood worlds apart. Regardless of background or circumstance, the vast skies, the punishing weather, the imposing landscapes, and the profound silences of the frontier left their mark on everyone who encountered them. In this way, even amid cultural clashes and conflict, the environment itself became a shared experience, a force shaping lives across boundaries of race, class, and nation. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again watch a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a much harsher reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, comforts made possible by technologies that frontier families could scarcely have imagined. And you may find yourself more aware of what was lost along the way, the practical self-sufficiency that once allowed people to build, mend, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with their own hands. Most importantly, you'll come to see that the real story of the American West isn't about dramatic gunfights or glittering gold strikes. It lies in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds, who endured extraordinary challenges with whatever limited resources they had. Their unembellished story contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, ingenuity, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and compassion to fill countless histories. Their legacy endures in the communities they founded, the environmental changes they set in motion, the cultural patterns they established, and yes, the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West vanished long ago, reshaped by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet echoes of the frontier still linger. They survive in regional identities, in local traditions, in patterns of land use and governance. And the memory of this formative period continues to shape how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities strive to replace simplistic mythologies with more accurate and inclusive accounts of what truly happened. As you finally give in to sleep, the line between past and present begins to blur. The struggles of frontier communities, adapting to harsh environments, managing scarce resources, building societies among diverse populations, balancing personal freedom with collective responsibility, remain deeply relevant today, even if the challenges take different forms. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier is not a set of clear answers, but a set of enduring questions. How do humans adapt to change? How do communities hold together in the face of adversity? And how should people live with the natural world that both sustains and constrains them? These are questions each generation must answer anew as circumstances evolve. Above you, the stars shine with a brilliance undimmed by time, the same stars that once guided travelers across the prairie, helped farmers time their planting, and offered comfort to immigrants far from home. Their light reminds us that while eras pass and landscapes change, the human search for meaning under the vast sky is timeless. In this quiet moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who once gazed upon these same constellations a century and a half ago. They, too, wondered what tomorrow might bring in a world where survival was never assured, where life, in all its brutality and beauty, was lived with an intensity few of us will ever know in our more comfortable age. Sleep takes you at last, carrying dreams of a West both unforgiving and magnificent. A place where human vulnerability and resilience stood side by side, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that shaped a nation's destiny, and where the daily grind of survival was punctuated by moments of transcendent awe before landscapes of staggering grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of its romantic illusions, remains a window into human existence at its most elemental. It was a place at once challenging, terrifying, and in fleeting moments sublime.